U.S. Transportation Secretary Shane Duffy said 17 years were gone, $16 billion spent, with no track laid. Why has this project been so complicated?
So it got off to a very bad start. It was being built in an area far from where the voters are, so it's not really something that's visible to a lot of people in the state. And it took the state a long time to sort of figure out how to get their workforce together and just learn how to build this pretty difficult linear infrastructure project. It's not difficult technically, but it's difficult legally, politically in California. It's basically any large project in California is quite complicated because there are so many veto points. Governance is so decentralized. Even if we didn't have this challenge between the state and federal government, we'd still have a tough time building high-speed rail. I think more recently, what we've seen is that the federal government, when it's controlled by Republicans, is very hostile to funding high-speed rail. And so there's battles over the funding. But the big issue with high-speed rail, it's only partially about funding. Most of it is about how quickly you can get approvals to build this kind of long distance linear infrastructure. And it's not like this is a brand new infrastructure. I mean, so this isn't a question of this is a difficult technology or new technology. It's really just a question of how well are our political processes set up to get this kind of infrastructure built as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible for the taxpayers and the residents of the state.
The problem was the promoters of the project had convinced the people of the state that the project could be built for an amount of money and on a time frame that was simply impossible. It could never be done. Secondarily, they did not establish a firm funding plan. The discussions at the time called for 1/3 of the money to come from state sources, 1/3 of the money to come from the federal government, and 1/3 of the money to come from the private sector. The problem was that there were no federal programs at that time that would finance high-speed rail. And the private sector rather rapidly made it clear that except for station area and other things like that, they would not invest in the project until it had been completed and until the demand had been successfully demonstrated. So what that meant was that as soon as the project started, the manager of the project didn't have the money they needed to actually conduct the project. The second element of this was that in California especially, the process of acquiring and taking private property is very complex. It is not easy. There are restrictions on how property can be taken and what the procedures are. It was very painful to see these delays that were caused by the various environmental restrictions or property restrictions.
There is a lot of comparison between China and the U.S. regarding the construction of high-speed rail systems. How do you see the comparison?
Well, it helps if you only have one party, in control of government. And in the United States, we have a democracy and we have a lot of different political party actors and a lot of conflict that's resolved through democracy. And so that makes it more complicated. That in China, there's not really a tradition of, one person standing in the way of a project that benefits, the whole region. But in the United States, we have a strong tradition of individualism, individual rights. And so we empower individuals to file lawsuits if they have an objection to a project and they're being injured in some ways by a project. So culturally, there might be a price to pay if you stand in the way of a project like this as an individual, but it happens a lot.
I know in China, a lot of the money came from state or local governments as well as the national government. But the leader clearly and the responsibility clearly was at the national level. And, that is not what happened in California. And it's probably not what would happen with any other high-speed rail project in the United States. And also in our government, at least, it's very hard to have a stable policy over a long period of time. governments change, policies change, and it's like the UK government where HS2, one government wants to build it and the other one wants to shut it down. And if you're a manager, you can't manage under those circumstances. It just doesn't work. But yes, China has the advantage of stable policy. But China Railways had the resources it needed. It didn't have to go begging every year looking for a new set of money. They knew what the money was and they had it and they managed it.
Thompson, in your presentation to the World Bank in April regarding California's high-speed rail, you argued that visions are not projects. Can you elaborate on this?
But until you have physical plans for what you're going to do, until you have the authority to do it, and until you have a funding plan in place that makes sure you can do what it is you're trying to do, and until you have the political coalition in place to agree on it and support you when you get into trouble, which you will, and you keep going, then you don't have a project, you have a vision. At least in the high-speed rail area, China's ability to convert ideas into projects is very strong.